Okay, welcome everyone to One New Change, which is the home of Turner and Townsend and Turner and Townsend Alinea. So those of us that are still at 90 Cannon Street are itching to get up here and join our colleagues, which is going to happen very, very soon, I assure you. My name is Steve Watts, by the way. I'm a director at Turner and Townsend Alinea, and for the last decade, one of my responsibilities has been to lead our research and insight agenda. And one thing we're always very keen to do is to disseminate our research, which is why we have these events. And these events tend to follow either our twice yearly market reports or our articles for Building Magazine. So many of you will know, some of you may not know, that we are committed to produce 4 articles for Building Magazine each year. Many of those we follow with a forum so that we can share our knowledge and get a bit of debate going as well. So this is based on the article that was published back in March on the whole subject of EPCs, which has grabbed the attention of the industry. And actually, we were very oversubscribed for this event, so we got at least as many people at home joining us online as we have in the room. And what I should say, by the way, is that if you do need to go to the toilet, go through the door at the back. There's no scheduled fire alarm today. If the fire alarm does go off, come through this door at the front. Get that out of the way. So my job is actually very straightforward today. I'm going to introduce our panel, and often in our articles, actually, we do collaborate with others, and this has been no exception. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the 3 of them now, and then invite them up to come and give their perspectives on the whole issue of EPCs, what it means for the industry, what practically we can and what is being done about the government's stated ambition, which is to regulate ever more stringently on energy efficiency. So to begin with, and who will start us off in a couple of minutes, we have Michael Cracknell, who's a fellow director at Turner and Townsend Alinea, and joined us last year after an 11-year stint at Deloitte, where, by the way, amongst other things, he was responsible for their crane surveys, which those of you who've read our market reports will know we reference quite regularly as a good source of what's happening in terms of construction activity and the pipeline. Michael's experience is actually, which spans about 30 years, covers many sectors, including, I believe, a hotel in Paris, a couple of airports in London and Madrid, even a car factory, I think, but not least a whole series of new build and refurbishment commercial office projects, for example, at King's Cross Central. And we were actually very pleased that Michael rejoined us, because many of us knew Michael back in Davis Langdon AECOM days 12 or 15 years ago. We then have Mark Ridley, a partner at Capital Real Estate Partners and a well-respected client of the business, and not least because, well, not just because of his leadership across many projects that we work with him on, but also he does contribute to our research agenda from time to time. Mark actually joined Capital Real Estate Partners back in 2019. He, like, similar sort of 3 decades of experience, but in the Central London development and investment market, which includes a 12-year stint at Jones Lang LaSalle, where he worked with his current fellow partner Nigel Fox in the city capital markets, and he was also 6 years at Stanhope. And finally, just to give a flavour of the breadth of his work, he's also got 10 years of experience as an advisor to Goldsmiths Company, which included leading its portfolio strategy across about 15 properties, something like that. And then Michael Edwards, who, for the purposes of today, I'm going to call Mike. So I've got a Michael and a Mike, so we don't get confused. Who's a mechanical engineer by training and profession, and a director at Arup, where he's worked for 11 years. His CV covers a variety of sectors and countries, but for the last decade, he's focused very much on London offices and in particular the refurbishment and reinvention of existing buildings, which is why he leads Arup's building retrofit service. He's also contributed to a number of industry publications over the last year, subsidiary in Syria, including technical guides on the use of heat pumps in both domestic and commercial buildings, which I'm sure is more fascinating than it sounds. You know, absolutely. So we've got quite a good spectrum of perspectives, from cost to funding, development and environmental engineering. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Michael to kick us off.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, all. So yeah, my task, we'll leave the other guys to do the clever bit. My task is really to sort of set the scene, tell you a little bit about where sort of government's at and what's happening. So EPC, I mean, the first bit sort of a bit ABC, energy performance certificates. So people should be aware of those. We saw them on our fridges many years ago. We're now buying houses and obviously buying and renting offices. You get an EPC certificate from an approved assessor. So there's a sort of a process you go through. And in terms of the legislation, it stems from a bit of a mouthful, the MEES, Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards, and the legislation even worse, the Energy Efficiency Private Rented Property and England and Wales regulations, PRS regulations of 2015, which themselves sort of stem from the Energy White Paper from the government in 2011, all of which is sort of premised around the government's aim to get the UK to net zero by 2050. And so they sort of lay out processes associated with that. Our focus today, EPC runs across the sort of the various building sectors. Our focus today, as was the building article, is probably really around the office environment. So in terms of where EPC's at, you're probably aware earlier this year, in April this year, new piece of legislation which required all buildings to achieve at least an E standard, whether you were whether it was being sort of just being re-rented or at all. So everything sort of fell into that new category, which sort of pushed things up a bit. And then at the bottom here, and there's question marks on these dates because it's at the moment intention rather than legislation, but in terms of all rented non-domestic buildings, the aim for the government is for us to reach B by 2030, and probably even more controversial is the idea of having a milestone of sort of EPC C by 27, which I'll come on to. So how are we doing? The graph on the left, taken from ONS data, looks at the sort of the last 15 years or so in terms of the sort of the transition across the grades. So A is the grey, A is the orange, you can barely see A, it's barely on there, is it? B is grey, yellow and blue, C and D respectively. And in fact, the F and G, which is the bit that the latest legislation has sort of pushed us away from, you can see we'd largely got away from that anyway. So clearly not such an issue. So that's sort of encouraging. The data on the right looks at London. There's EPC data that's available for anybody to analyse. So this just looks at the sort of key areas of the city, Westminster, town hamlets, which is really Canary Wharf, and Hackney. And this looks at those buildings that are less than grade B. So thinking ahead, looking at sort of the implication of achieving this 2030 deadline. So 70%, 73%, 82% in Canary Wharf, and 67 in Hackney are not at grade B yet. They're all sort of C, Ds and Es type of thing. So quite a lot of work to do if those buildings are going to remain as offices to deal with that. And to try and put that into some sort of context, hopefully you can see the numbers at the back. But if you assume, and I think there's probably more, but if you assume that the central London office market is something like 250 million square foot, if you assume as well that perhaps as a function of hybrid and clearly the whole thing settling down, that 10–20% of that might fall out from being office space. We'll probably need less space. The absolute amount of less space is clearly a sort of an ongoing discussion, but let's assume for simplistic numbers that it's 20%. So we took out 50, which gets us to 200. And then you have to recognise with EPC, an EPC certificate lasts for 10 years. So you can get your EPC certificate, the landlord, whoever is responsible for doing the work, might to do further work within the building, but might not get a further EPC certificate. So there's a sort of recognition that the published data is almost by definition slightly out of date as a consequence of that. So again, let's be generous and assume that 100 million square foot is already at A and B, which then leaves 100 to get to grade B. And the little graph at the bottom comes from the dear old Deloitte Crane survey, but this is about the amount of office space that is put onto the market each year, roughly something like 5 million square foot. And it's true to say, in terms of getting buildings up to an EPC B level, that isn't necessarily significant refurb, but some of the sort of the stuff that you need to do is pretty significant, and so it starts to fall into that category. So the point being here is, if typically the industry has been doing 5 million square foot per year, and if you take 100 million and divide it by the 7 years we've got left until 2030, that's 14 million square foot per year. The industry cannot cope with doing 14 million square foot per year when it's currently pushing out 5. So there's a bit of a maths problem there. This is a piece of work that BPB, Building Better Partnerships, did. It's a 2019 report where they were understanding the correlation between EPC, and EPC is obviously understanding the potential energy benefit of a building compared to the actual benefit. And the graph there on the right, the sort of each line is a building, EPC grades set across the bottom, and the height of the bar is a function of the energy intensive use of those buildings. And what it sort of shows is that there's not a very good correlation between the EPC grades you've got and how much energy you use or don't use in your building. Because clearly you can have a perfectly engineered building, but if as the landlord doesn't use it very well and you use too much energy, you still don't. It's not a sort of a guaranteed success, I suppose, what it amounts to. So an interesting sort of a dilemma in terms of how you regulate around that, which we'll come to. This then takes it forward a little bit further, and this is why this whole subject is somewhat complex. So this is UKGBC's whole life carbon roadmap, looks at the whole sort of how we're going with energy back from 1990, which is the sort of the starting point and the comparison point. The vertical line is where we are at the moment, and sort of blown up on the right there for you. And it's just making the point. So the blue is around electricity, energy and use, the sort of the stuff that we're pushing through. We are doing pretty well as a nation in terms of greening the grid and reducing the amount of energy usage that's going forward, which is the reason why the stuff in the brown at the top there, the embodied carbon, which is a subject in development on everybody's lips at the moment and sort of causing people lots of frustration in how to deal with that, becomes much more significant. And so there's almost a bit of a dichotomy here between improving your building and doing a refurb to get your EPC certificate, and in the same breath using a load of carbon to achieve it. So the two things are slightly in conflict. So again, it's sort of there's no sort of simple answer here. So just in terms of what is the government doing, I sort of made the point that they've sort of laid out their general approach. They're looking to sort of achieve B by 2030. They made that slight sort of change with respect to legislation this year to push everybody up to at least E. There was two, in fact, there's been more. There was consultation papers back in 19. These two consultation papers were 2021. The first one looks at implementation improvements of the existing legislation, basically, and thinking about how some of that needs to work. So there's some sort of simple stuff in terms of improving enforcement and making enforcement the resources that are required to achieve enforcement slightly less. So that's the day-to-day stuff of government, if you like. They talk about landlord versus tenant. Clearly the EPC is really a sort of a landlord issue, but you can recognise as you go up the EPC grades, if you're developing a shell and core building, achieving a B with a shell and core building and not taking account of the fit out is a bit complex. So there has to be thought processes as to how you deal with that, and how you how you expect, how you make the landlord do what you require in terms of maintaining. I mean, most people are going to want to do it, as it were, but making sure that the tenant does the sort of follows the same philosophy as the landlord. There's various rules and sort of exceptions within the EPC. The 7-year payback rule is around a sort of an economic test, and there's discussions within the consultation paper as to whether they amend that, stretch it out to 7 years, stretch it out even to 10 years rather, as well as sort of looking at the sort of the SBLEM, simplified building energy model, that sort of sits behind the EPC. So quite a lot of sort of technical stuff to sort of try and improve the process. At the same time, pretty much at the same time, they issued this second paper as well. Second paper looked at the performance, so recognizing that EPC is about potential performance. This was about actual usage. The little image you can see just to the right of it is the cover off of Neighbours, and there's a sort of a recognition that the Neighbours system, running for over 20 years, is probably at the forefront of sort of where we need to be in terms of looking at the actual energy usage. So this paper then looks at how we sort of do the two things together. There's sort of various ideas as to how we keep one running and then bring the Neighbours piece in at the same time. You can imagine actually that the EPC legislation will run out of sort of after a sort of 10-20 years. It'll become irrelevant anyway, because everybody's up to A and B. It sort of falls away as a concept. So ultimately we just get to the sort of the performance piece, but the piece in between, and that's a critical period in terms of us getting to 2030, is super complex. How you sort of bring these two pieces of legislation together, how you make them to work, how you don't make it too complex, etc., 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 is probably why these consultations that were published in 2021 have not reported yet. Nothing is sort of happening. So that's a bit of a worry, in as much as sort of where this is going. I could be less beneficial to the government in terms of why it's not progressing, but in general we can sort of recognise that it's sort of pretty tricky in terms of sort of making all this work. Offices, in terms of the performance base, and the sort of the focus will be on buildings of 1,000 square meters. There's a recognition that buildings of 1,000 square meters only represent 7% of the of buildings by number, but over 50% of area. So the sort of the big buildings are the ones that count. So that sort of makes sense. And in terms of some of the sort of the feedback, so the logos there, in terms of support for the 2030 target, generally the sort of various bodies are pretty supportive of the 2030 target. The 2027 target, this sort of stopping at sort of C at 2027, less well received, concerns that it just sets up two layers of sort of work, potential confusion, etc., etc., and frankly we're probably too close to it now anyway, type of thing. So it feels like it's unlikely to happen. Suggested the need, this is really responding to the first one, but really suggesting the need to measure actual energy performance. So are the requirements associated with the second one. And then that rather nicely leads me on to the concerns that some people were flagging around stranded assets. So I'll leave Mark to take us forward.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a couple of slides here, but really, in essence, I think the three key things I want to talk about today are occupiers, investors and developers, and implications on market dynamics. So if we talk about occupiers first, I think the occupier market, particularly in London, there are a number of factors that are driving quite strong change in the market, and environmental performance is one of them, but it's not the whole thing. I think COVID and the post-COVID world, as we're all aware, has fundamentally driven occupiers to reassess how they use offices. And I think positive thing for us who are in the office game is definitely we're not in the spot where we were month 3 of COVID, where the office is dead, everyone's going to work from home. I think as we all know, more and more Businesses are heading back to some form of hybrid working. In many cases, that's majority of the time in the office as opposed to out of the office. And the dynamics around all of this are, and I think as Michael alluded to in his analysis, is we are likely going to see less demand overall for offices going forwards in London. No one really knows, but it feels sort of 10 to 20% is a good is a good ready reckoner. I think that's going to affect different markets in different ways, because perversely some areas and some markets might actually see a net increase in demand, because businesses are saying, right, we've got this new way of working, it's hybrid, we've got our staff coming in 3 days a week, not coming in 2 days a week, whatever it is. We need to make the office a really attractive place to be. So I think it's going to mean less space but better quality, and better quality means transport, very important, amenity in the building, but also the environment, and environmental performance. I'll come up in a second. So if you take that, you can see some areas are probably going to perform really well, and some areas are going to really struggle within that sort of overall sort of net reduction in demand. Environmental performance is an important part of that overall better quality business office space that people are looking for. If you're trying to let 2,000 square foot suites, it's pretty low down the list for people. But certainly if you're talking of 10,000 square foot suites where you've got businesses that might be 80 to 150 people plus, generally they will have a public footprint, ESG agenda, and environmental performance of their offices is definitely part of the the metric they look at. And from our experience of letting space, anything over 10,000 feet, we are always asked by a potential occupier what are the environmental performance standards in buildings. So it is front and center of any significant sized occupier as a key question, or as an important question, not the only question. I think the kind of final thing I would say about occupiers is that we've had the debate, and Michael's alluded to it in terms of is EPC really the right tool, because we know it's a sort of potential performance rather than actual performance, and there's quite a wide variation in terms of actual energy use within a sort of an EPC standard, depending on the building. I think the one thing I would say to us as an industry, looking at our customers who are occupiers, we need to be careful about not talking to ourselves the whole time, because actually the occupational market, my feeling is EPC, they use it as a useful ready reckoner of the environmental performance of building. And once we start talking about neighbours, letting, we all know that that's a more accurate benchmark of how buildings actually perform. But it's that sort of technical understanding, is generally not within the skill set of many occupiers. So I do think EPC is an important rating from a market standpoint for occupiers. So if we move on to the sort of investor developer community, I think if you look at the REITs or UK institutions, they've been quite far ahead of the curve in terms of environmental performance, compared to tenants. I think just something I was involved in briefly for a while, which was Columbia Threadneedles and Stanhope's and Carbon Trust Low Carbon Workplace Fund, which was started in 2010, 2011, and was very much ahead of occupier expectations on low energy buildings. But it was a great product because a lot of institutional investors really bought into investing sustainably, and so I think that the UK institutional REIT market is very much ahead, and I think for them, I was talking earlier to someone, EPC is generally viewed there as just a part of a tool and not particularly effective. I just come back to this point that our customers, occupiers, do think it's quite important. By the way, if you're talking central London, where a lot of real estate is now owned by overseas investors, so overseas institutions understand it, but there's a lot of sort of privately or effectively privately owned assets, and those investors generally are much further behind the curve in understanding the importance of environmental performance of buildings in terms of the marketplace. Because we talk about, if we go on to that, absolutely environmental performance, and let's use EPC, which is, as I said, a good ready recognize, is a real and an important, more important, increasingly important driver on values. If you've got a sophisticated investor, they will absolutely, if they're looking at an asset and it's an EPCD or an EPCE or an EPCC, they will be factoring into the price the cost of getting that up to an EPCB as one of the metrics. They might well be using others, so that is going to come straight off the price. And I think it's even more significant than that, because I think there are some buildings, we come back to the stranded assets. One of the points about, we've talked about location and other things, but one of the other ways that I think a building is currently being stranded is where you have a poor environmentally performing building, which might be in quite a good location, but is multi-let. There's no natural date to achieve vacant possession, and I think our industry has not really it's not really been clear how you retrofit these buildings with occupiers in situ to get to an EPCB or better, because the technical people understand it much better than me. But what I do know is, to get to EPCB, it's not just turning down the boiler a couple of notches and replacing some lights. Of course, that's very important, but you've got to look at the central plant, and that is difficult with occupiers in situ or attending to the cladding. So I think that's a real challenge for us in terms of helping investors with multi-let buildings. How do you bring those up whilst you've got tenants in situ? Oh no, wrong way. There we go, 50-50, I got it wrong. And just the final bit is just sort of some comments on the market, and I think empirically the importance of good quality assets as a key driver and retainer of value we can see in the market. Because if you just look at some statistics, so the vacancy rate in central London is about 9% now. And that's a lot higher than the long-term average, about 5.5%. So you would think that demand supply is very much sort of tenant favourable, rent should be softening, and in many parts of the market they are. But if you want a good quality building for an occupier, and I come back to it, energy performance being one of the things, you are paying record rents effectively. So JLL's last quarterly report showed city rents increasing, prime city rents increasing from 72.50 to 75. That's for non-tower space. You're well into the 90s now for a tower floor in the City of London. And I think the one thing I would say is energy performance is not the only determinant of achieving a premium price, but you won't achieve a premium rental price without having a sustainable building. So that's the kind of thing. It's one of the key factors, but not the only factor. I think the final thing I'd like to say is, I think the dynamics of of all of this and where rents are going and where supply is going is quite interesting, because the fact is that currently, with investment yields, cap rates moving outwards very significantly because the cost of money, with build costs partly driven by the fact that being green is expensive, but also because of general inflation coming through, it's really hitting viability. So right now, on an appraisal, it's really difficult to justify starting many projects. So I think that means two things. I think there's going to be a slowdown in delivering of new projects because viability is going to be difficult. And what does that mean? It means that to correct viability, we've got to see build costs slow down, we've got to see cap rates come down, or we've got to see rents go up. And I'm guessing cap rates and build costs will go in the right direction at some stage, but the real factor is tenants are going to have to pay a lot more money for good space if they want it, and that sounds quite scary in one sense to us. But I think the final point I would make is actually renting space in London is pretty cheap compared to what it has been. So my favourite is, back in 1987, it cost you 70 quid to rent the best space in London. It now costs you 75. So in real terms, it's a lot cheaper. So, you know, if tenants have to pay, I don't know what it is, £100 a foot for good non-tower space in London, it sounds really scary to us, but actually, I think that, you know, that's affordable on a historic basis. So those are my points.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Mark. I wasn't expecting you to say that office space has got cheaper. That's a new headline for me. So we've heard a little bit about where the legislation's taking us. We've heard about volumes. We've heard about market drivers. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the sort of delivery, the implementation of things to kind of help improve energy performance in buildings. And I think Michael and Mark have probably already said it for me, but you know, you've not been listening if you've not heard that there's not a direct correlation between an EPC rating of the building and its actual operational performance. But it is important to reiterate that, because I think in some terms, chasing those higher EPC ratings, whilst I think I agree with Mark that it is important we make a clear message to occupiers and tenants, it isn't necessarily going to deliver you a strong environmentally performing building, and that is an important thing to remember. And so when we look at the kind of interventions we can apply in buildings, all of these will have an impact on the operational performance of a building, but only some of them will have an impact on the EPC rating, because the EPC is a model and not all of these things change anything that goes into that model. So if you're not changing a parameter, you're not going to get a different result. So Michael talked about the volume of buildings. There's a lot of buildings, and Mark mentioned a lot of those buildings are occupied at the moment. So you need to have a suite of things you can do to implement energy upgrades. Some of them are low disruption interventions, some of them more significant. Picking up on a couple of things that have been successful. We do a lot of work with clients tuning buildings, so that's very low intervention type stuff. Looking at the existing operation, the control systems, the BMS, perhaps changing set points and just making the building work properly. Similarly, engaging with tenants can have a significant impact on energy performance. On a major portfolio holder at the moment in London, we've saved about 15% simply from tuning with very limited capital investment. But that's not going to improve the EPC of those buildings at all. So that's important to remember. The more significant interventions you see over there, things like electrifying heat and hot water within buildings, upgrading air handling units, upgrading other central plant, and then the really big ticket items that are very disruptive, fabric and facade upgrades. You know, those are the things where you're going to get the really big changes in terms of energy performance, but they're also much more disruptive, they're more expensive, and they're more difficult to plan around tenants. Saying that, we are getting to grips with the kind of work Mark was talking around MEP upgrades now around city tenants. We have various projects now, as I'm sure others do, where we have tenants with, you know, significant operational resilience requirements. We're making heat decarbonisation works around their business, and that's working well. And I don't want to add complexity, but I think it is important to refer back to Michael's point around embodied carbon. So My colleague Stephen Hill at Arup wrote in the CIBSE Journal this month around the sort of the challenges of chasing better compliance ratings and not thinking carefully about the embodied carbon impact as well. So while we're putting new stuff into buildings, we're putting new cladding systems or replacing glazing, there's a high embodied carbon penalty that goes with that. We need to properly check that the whole life benefit of that is actually worthwhile. And I think there's a danger here that we kind of head towards better EPC ratings. We don't think about the overall carbon impact, and we could end up in the wrong place. The obvious analogy here is the sort of the push for diesel cars in the early 2000s. You know, everyone thought that was a great thing for reducing transport greenhouse gas emissions. In some ways it was, but it also had the unintended consequences of negative air quality. So we've got to plan this carefully. It's not good to add complexity, but it's important we think about that. This slide talks a little bit more about the feasibility and other considerations around the types of interventions. So it is, and I think I would say it is important that we look at the specific buildings or assets we're talking about here. There's a lot of work going on looking at strategically what can be done and what could be done at asset or portfolio level particularly. But I think you do have to, fundamentally you do have to get into the building and understand what you can do. What are the specific constraints of any particular building? What are the opportunities? I would say that wouldn't I'm a consultant, but I think it is important that you have, you know, good professional teams to really work out what you can do. So there are a number of key parameters shown here. Impact on tenants I've talked a little bit about before, but when you're talking about the easier and the more difficult types of interventions, looking at lease periods, looking at whether there's swing space, existing swing space tenants can move in between floors to facilitate works, is a really important consideration. And tenants and occupiers are really important here, because actually what we're starting to see is occupiers engaging more with landlords. They're becoming more demanding of landlords about what they want to see in their space. You know, how good is the space I occupy and how can you help me make it better? And I think we're starting to see evidence of tenants actually looking to stay in buildings if environmental performance improvements come as part of refurbishments and improvements in the building. So that's a driver that we're starting to see, which is great. I think it's also important that we think about going back to the kind of embodied carbon issue, that we tend to think of new buildings that we need to look at a fabric first approach. So we need to make sure that demand is low first, usually by making the envelope very good, very efficient, and then we focus on energy efficiency. Because those things are much more difficult with existing buildings, you know, renewing glazing, replacing facades, and they carry a high embodied carbon penalty. Perhaps for existing buildings, the focus should be on the energy efficiency first as a priority rather than the fabric first. And I think particularly 2030 is not that far away. A lot of other businesses, let alone EPC targets, have their own ESG targets anyway. The kind of interventions we can make to really improve energy performance are going to be more focused on really looking at the operational performance, tuning the buildings, electrifying heat, and doing those things that you can do around sitting tenants. So I'm very keen to ensure we do have that focus, and that's what I've written about in this article. I am going to hand back to Michael now, because I'm going to get out my depth now if I start talking about the costs of implementing all of these different things. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, so actually I spend most of my time working out the cost of these things. That's what I do as a day job. And no surprise, you know, bearing in mind what Mark was saying in terms of where the funders are at and looking at the sort of the stepping process to get from E to D to B to C to B. I'll even get it right. That's really important for people to understand what the sort of cost is of bringing buildings up to a point where they're more valuable or more valuable going forward. The other line that's probably worth pointing out on this slide is this impact on the lease. And we've sort of been looking at this sort of idea of a tipping point, you know, tuning at one end, not really much capital cost at all, some relatively sort of low level impact things. And we've got some costs along the bottom, but frankly, they're so broad that it's really quite difficult. You have to look at a building individually to truly understand this stuff. But we're sort of saying 30 to say £120 for some low level impact stuff, running up to sort of £200 for something you might be able to achieve with your tenant still sitting in the building. You might be able to achieve the central plant replacement, you might not. And I think it's, you know, Mike's point is that the tenants are probably a little bit more happy to put up with things a bit more if they can sort of work with the landlord to make this stuff happen. So things are perhaps a little easier than they were. But I think the main thing from a cost point of view is when you get to this tipping point of really you're into a serious refurbishment. Mark's point again, can you actually clear the building out of the tenants? Can you make it a vacant building? How easy is that to do? And then do this piece of refurbishment. And obviously the concern that comes from a funding point of view is you might be doing that serious piece of refurbishment, you know, 5 or 10 years earlier than you would otherwise have done. And so that has implications. And so I think that's the sort of the key piece rather than the absolute, you know, the capital cost of the sort of the changes in between. I think that's us, and we can move on to questions.
Thank you. Maybe if I could invite the three of you to sit at the front then. I'm not sure how, I don't think we've got roaming mics, by the way, so I'm not sure how this is going to be. If you could project your voices, that'd be really good. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I'm sure some of you might have some. I've got a whole list of things I've just written down, but I'll allow you to some time to ask your own. But I would like, maybe if I just start with just a couple of points of facts, because Michael, you showed some pretty stark figures up there which suggests that 70% of existing stock in London is not at least a B level, and yet the buildings that we sort of all know we'd think, really? Are there a lot of sort of smaller, older buildings that drag that figure down?
So there's one further slide, if you take a look, guys, it doesn't matter because the numbers are so tiny. But in terms of getting to this data, part of levelling up is the people that hold the data. If you just go onto their website, you'll get an individual building. So there's a bit of a process to go through, which if you're interested, I can talk you through afterwards. But effectively, this is looking at the City of London. There is 279 buildings in the City of London that are relevant. 2,792 that are relevant. 2,400 of which are less than 100,000 square foot. So you sort of think, oh, well, you know, surely that's where all the problems are. But actually, if you analyse both, you know, the sort of the small buildings and the top buildings, the numbers pretty much, bigger buildings are in a slightly better place as you would sort of expect, but not in a significant way. So even if you wipe out the sort of the 90%, which represents the tiny buildings, the numbers are still 60 to 70%. So nothing changes. Admittedly, if you change one of the biggest buildings of 1 million square foot, that helps to push your number up. But yeah.
Okay, and maybe Mike, neighbours was mentioned by both yourself and Mark. I mean, on a daily basis, we tend to refer to neighbours in terms of new projects more than we do EPCs. Could you just give us a quick outline of the difference between the two and how each is calculated?
I'll give you a quick outline. Yeah. So EPC is a compliance model. So that's effectively a national calculation method standardised test. You have to do it to let or sell a building. It takes what you call regulated energy, not unregulated energy, and it's done at the design stage. So it's a theoretical potential performance of the building. And it doesn't include some of the stuff that Neighbours does. Neighbours is a design stage model and it's a post-completion model. So it's much more detailed. It includes all of the different energy consuming loads in the building. It's very rigorously reviewed so if we did it, we'd have to get it independently reviewed by another consultant. And then you only get the rating after the building's been in operation for a year. And it's based on the actual meter data you see. So one's a kind of I guess it's a potential, and the other's an actual, simplest way of putting it.
Okay. All right,
I think it's worth saying it's been in the market in Australia for 20-25 years now, so it's had a pretty significant impact on performance there in lots of ways, actually.
Okay, Mark, maybe I can ask you this in two parts. You refer to EPCs as being a good ready reckoner. I mean, from a building owner's perspective, the first part of the question is, are you seeing a rush from them to assess their buildings on an EPC basis and plan to upgrade their buildings? And the second part of the question, I guess, is from a funder's perspective, given that this is yet to become legislation and there's a question mark about whether it will become legislation anytime soon, are they taking it seriously?
But I would say that it is pretty front and central for any owner in London right now, or any building of any size, to come back to the market. I'm guessing if you've got floor plates of 5,000 foot plus, you're thinking about this very carefully in terms of driving to value and less stability, and in projects where we're involved in terms of looking at refurbishment post vacant possession, or indeed multi-let assets where we know we've got space coming up, how you get to be is kind of is probably the sort of the base environmental performance standard we're all looking at, and then we're obviously talking about neighbours in use, but that is the kind of it's the sort of anticipated legislation that's really front and centre. And I think that you know, we have to be a bit careful, certainly where you know, we advising an overseas investor, and you know, we talk a lot about EPC, and then you happen to mention, well, it's in a white paper and it's not guaranteed yet. They're sort of looking at you and saying, well, why are we doing this? You know, it's not, if it's, you know, it might not become legislation, but I think the fact is the market assumes it is going to become legislation, and therefore it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay. And sort of Michael and Mike, in your daily jobs, you're doing a lot of work with clients on just assessing these sorts of options.
Yes, we are. I think there's a different emphasis from different people in terms of whether they're more interested in their EPC rating or their operational performance rating. I think from my perspective, perhaps it's the type of projects we do. I think with more of our clients we're engaging with are more interested in the actual operational performance than the EPCs. Perhaps that's sort of, you know, the place in the market where some of the projects we're seeing are. I think when you have big organisations who have strong ESG strategy, that's particularly important to us, because they know that simply collecting EPCs isn't going to help them report.
I would just sort of add to that. You know, I think if you think about it, if you're a REIT or an institution and you're REIT, you're owned by pension funds or private investors, or your institution and you're looking after pension holders' money. If you look at it from that perspective, and obviously they've got their ESG targets, are really, you know, if you're a pension holder in one of the UK institutions, you would expect your money to be invested in a very environmentally sustainable way. So, I mean, I think if you're in real estate, certainly. So I think it is very logical, and I think that community is more advanced actually than the occupier community currently.
Yeah, maybe I could just develop that question, Michael, from your perspective. You talked about this tipping point in terms of the assessments you're costing. Is there sort of this? There are two levels. There's the level that upgrades the building to achieve these, what people are assuming will become legislative benchmarks, or is there more of an encouragement to actually reinvent the building to provide amenities and all the other things that differentiate the office product from the competition?
I think it's definitely both, because I think, as Mark was saying, you know, the energy piece is one component of why someone decides to, you know, rent a building, or what drives the rental value of the building. So inevitably, when you're about to spend some money doing something about your asset, you're going to take on board the energy aspect, but other things as well. So these things sort of get wrapped in, and it's not that clear. I mean, what's actually quite interesting is we've got clients and funders who are asking the cost of, as I said, sort of stepping up the ladder. We've got other clients sitting on a B-rated building saying, actually, I'd quite like to improve my building to get the very best rents. And so there are people who are sort of even ahead of some of the sort of latent landlords, if you like, that have been, you know, used to sitting there collecting rent and have got a bit of a, you know, awakening call coming, because this, you know, when and if this legislation lands, we're probably not going to have much time to deal with it.
Any question? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Peter Ward from King's College London and the United States Hospital. So an occupier, but also landlord in relation to life science rented space for tenants last. Is there any sort of exception being considered? Because intrinsically some of our research activity is quite energy consumption, and in better likely any way some of our buildings will ever be able to achieve it. Is there any sort of flexibility being considered in policy around it? Are there things that you would advise both the occupier and the landlord to consider?
I'd like to take that. That's some in-depth knowledge.
I guess there's two points to that. So from life sciences building, I can't see why, and obviously the EPC is about the potential building. So it's about having good insulation, a sensible strategy for your central plant rooms and all that stuff, which there's no reason why you can't do that. So I imagine there's no reason why you can't get a good EPC rating. Your performance rating, by definition, albeit performance ratings are about comparisons, so they would be about comparing you to another life sciences operator. So you can still score well in terms of a life sciences operator. You're always going to be spending more energy than a straightforward office course.
I just, as a practical example of that, and it is a very good point, is that a building we're looking at now to refurbish, and this is about EPC rather than in-use performance. There's a big tenant generator in the building that's very power hungry. And all the life safety systems are hooked up to that, because in some ways you might as well have one generator to do both. But as part of the refurbishment, we're looking at pulling the landlord's life safety backup out of that tenant generator and putting it into a separate landlord's generator, which actually was there and be decommissioned, because then that allows you as a landlord to use the much more efficient landlord's generator as part of your EPC assessment. And then coming back to the point, then the tenant itself might be power hungry, but you sort of done what you can to improve the potential performance of the building.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned that EPC ratings as in looking at a significant like the same. What's the kind of disincentive for landlords in the industry?
Yeah, so the point was that EPC certificates last for 10 years. So you get your certificate, and yes, you may do work through that period, and that might mean actually if you were to go and seek to renew that certificate before the 10 years, you might actually get yourself up the ladder. And so hence my comment about the data having a sort of potential natural lag in it. I guess it's probably a function of what's happening in your leasing market. If you're leasing the building or parts of the building, it's going to be, and getting an EPC certificate is relatively inexpensive. Why wouldn't you do that and make your building, as Mark says, more attractive in the market? If you've got a tenant that's taken up the whole building and is going to be there a long time, and as I said, if you're a landlord that's not very active, you might not. So I suspect it's in their interests clearly if there's sort of leasing activity going on to ensure that you put the best spin on the building that you can.
I think there's possibly another aspect to this as well, which is that there are some EPCs. Some EPCs are better than other EPCs, so it depends how it's been calculated. What the process was. There are different levels of EPCs in terms of how you calculate it. So you might not necessarily get a better result in your EPC just because you've redone it again later on, even if you've made improvements. The other aspect is the Part L regulations have changed recently as well. So it's fed from that, and it's quite a black box. So you may not know what you're going to get out of it until you've actually run it, which is a problem. You can still do the work and understand what you get, and you don't have to lodge a certificate. But I think sometimes if someone's got a decent enough certificate, they can wait until the last possible moment. Probably.
Well, I might think it's a whole other point, but I get the feeling, I know I don't understand technically, but a lot of the assessment models are quite unsophisticated. So you know, they don't take account of all the tiny little things that you do can improve your energy. It's quite sort of boxy in that, you know, you do something major and you get this, you do something else major and you get this, and all the little bits the models are not so good at picking up, and that's a whole other area.
Not particularly, no.
I mean, one of the aspects of the first consultation I spoke about was a recognition that the models for particularly for older and listed buildings are really not very good. And so that was one of the things that I'm seeking to, you know, think about how do you improve that.
Conscious of time, but yes, one more question.
What are your thoughts on all of the listed buildings, especially around the West End, for cost, program, and feasibility of the retrofits, not only for the regulation and the DC, but also for the actual performance?
So if we take the EPC piece first, in terms of, I said there were some various economic tests that can be applied. So there's economic tests, and there's also a recognition that some listed building won't be, you know, changing and improving the fabric of the building is an important and one of the sort of final steps to getting a good EPC. It's potentially not possible on some listed buildings. So there is a point at which you go as far as you can, and then you get an exemption to, you know, accept the fact you can't go any further. So there's a combination of economic and sort of regulatory bits that sort of help that situation.
Yeah, I'd support that. And I think there's a sort of a recognition that the types of buildings you mentioned, you'd call them harder to decarbonise. And there's a recognition that they're not necessarily going to achieve the same sort of levels of performance. I'm talking actual performance as well as a building where you don't have such restrictions on the fabric. So I think, you know, that's kind of a special case, and I think that's accepted, and it should be. Agree with that.
Okay, given the time, I'm going to call it a day there. If you would like to continue and have a chat over a coffee, then please, you're very welcome to do so. We've got this room for a little while, but please join me in thanking our three panelists for their time. Finally, I did mention that this is part of a whole series of research initiatives and studies that we do. Our next one is going to be published online in Building Tomorrow, which is about modular construction, which will have a cost model attached to it, very subject to my very close to my heart. And our next market paper will be published later this month, which will be followed by one of these events too. But thank you all for joining us. Appreciate your time as well. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really good. Nice. Thank you. Good. We're still staying for a lot of questions. Thank you. Really got page and notes. So some really good sound bites. That's the one. That's in 1987. £70 a square foot. Sort of. Yeah.
So really,
Less than 10%.
not that expensive.
No, it's really interesting. So it's the same thing. So it's therefore valuably popped up by you over time.
It's a really good point. It's been propped up by, yes, Kensington's a bit ahead of it really well because build costs have been relatively stable.